In this section, we're going to look at inverse trigonometric functions. So in other words, how do we go backwards from the given values of the trigonometric angle, right? So we're going to take a look at the inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent functions. We're going to be able to sketch the graphs of those functions. And then we're going to be able to evaluate expressions that are related to our inverse trigonometric functions. The way this is going to be set up is that we're going to take a look at each of the three inverse trigonometric functions to begin with. So let's start with the inverse sine function. The first thing we should notice is that there are two ways to write the inverse sine function. One of which is like this, okay, so sine minus 1. Now I want you to notice that this is not the same as 1 over the sine of x, okay? So that is not the same thing, okay? So inverse sine is going to be either sine minus 1. Another way, and this is the way I prefer to write it, I prefer to write it as the arc sine, all right? So I'm going to try to use arc sine more often throughout this, but I wanted you to be aware that these two mean the same thing. Now, let's take a look at the graph of the arc sine function. And we remember that for a function to have an inverse, it has to pass the horizontal line test, right? And so what I want you to notice is that from here to here, okay, on the regular old sine function, okay? So I'm just going to sketch this, okay? So this would be the point pi halves comma 1, and this would be the point negative pi halves negative 1. Okay, on the graph. Anything past that, okay, so if I started going there, notice it would fail the horizontal line test, okay? So the sine function is going to have an inverse over this domain from negative pi halves to pi halves. And so what I've sketched right here is what the arc sine function looks like, okay? So this is y equals arc sine of x. I was trying to write arc sine and the computer doesn't want me to write on it apparently. Okay, so this is the arc sine of x function. Okay, so the domain for the arc sine function is going to be from -1 to 1. Okay, so remember, an inverse function interchanges the domain and the range of that. Okay, so what we did was we flipped these points around. Okay, so we bounded the arc sine function or the sine function, and then we've reversed the domain and the range. Okay, so we're flipping the coordinates. Okay, so again, the domain is from -1 to 1, and the range is from negative pi halves to pi halves. So on our unit circle, when we're dealing with the arc sine function, we are only looking from here to here. Okay, so this would be negative pi halves for the angle, and this would be from pi halves. All right, so we're going to use that to be able to, in a few moments, to be able to evaluate expressions with respect to the arc sine function. Okay, so again, with the arc sine function, we don't think about anything in quadrants 2 and 3. Okay, we're only worried about these two quadrants. All right, now one of the things that we need to do is we need to be able to evaluate inverse trigonometric functions. All right, so given all that information, okay, let's make sure that we remember what the graph of the arc sine function looks like. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can go through and be able to evaluate. Okay, so if I have the arc sine of -1/2, what that means is that there's going to be some angle. So we're going to say theta is going to be equal to arc sine of -1/2, all right? Or in other words, the sine of some angle is equal to -1/2. And so that's where we're going to go into the unit circle. And we're going to look for -1/2. Now remember, the sine function, so the sine of theta is given by the y coordinate. So we're going to look at all the y coordinates, and we finally find one that's -1/2. Okay, so right here is -1/2. Okay, but the angle that corresponds to that is 11 pi 6. But what we're really looking at is what's in the domain, which is going to be -pi 6, the coterminal angle. Okay, so whenever we give these answers, okay, if I was to say that this was 11 pi 6, unfortunately, that's not in the range, okay? So we would have to say negative pi 6, okay? So that's the arc sine function, okay? We're looking for the y coordinate on the unit circle that gives us this value, okay? And if it's in quadrant 4, we have to use the coterminal angle, okay? So for instance, this one would be negative pi fourths, this would be negative pi thirds, and this would be negative pi halves. Now, if I want the arc sine of root 3 over 2, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the unit circle, and I'm just going to look for where we have root 3 over 2 as a y coordinate. And this one's a lot easier because it's positive. And so I notice right here at root 3 over 2, the angle is pi thirds. Okay, so this would just be pi thirds. Okay, so again, the arc functions give us an angle. Okay, so what this means is that theta is equal to the arc sine of root 3 over 2, or that means that the sine of theta is going to be equal to root 3 over 2, and we're looking for this angle. Okay, so that's why we get pi thirds from that. So now we have the sine of negative root 2 over 2, right? And so we look in our unit circle, and we're looking for negative root 2 over 2. And so if we look at it, eventually we'll run into this y coordinate, okay? And it's not going to be 7 pi fourths, it's going to be the coterminal angle, and that would be negative pi fourths, all right? And just to remind everybody how to get that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 2 pi, okay? So just like over here, what I did was I subtracted 2 pi, which is going to be the same thing as 7 pi fourths minus 8 pi over 4, all right? So I'd have to multiply and divide by 4, and we know 7 minus 8 is negative 1 pi over 4, all right? So if I was to go through and say the coterminal angle to 7 pi fourths, it would just be negative pi fourths. What I always tell people is just look, ignore the 11, the 7, and the 3, and just take the negative of the pi and the number in the denominator. Okay, that's how you can take the coterminal angles of all of those. Okay, it's actually pretty easy. So for instance, 11 pi 6, don't worry about the negative, just turn that into a negative. Don't worry about the 11, just turn that into a negative, and it would be negative pi over 6 would be that coterminal angle. Okay, so going back here, this is going to be negative pi fourths. Oh, and of course we want to use our calculator to make sure that we check this. All right, so let me show you in the calculator how we can check these answers. So if I was to go into my calculator and I look for the arc sine function, I would say sine, for instance, of, we had something like, for instance, we had negative 1/2, okay? So I would say arc sine minus 1 of minus 1 over 2. All right, I make sure I'm in radian mode, all right? And that gives us negative 0.5267, etc. All right. Then what I would do is I would type in negative pi over 6 just to check, all right? And these numbers are exactly the same. So that's how you guys can check to make sure that you've gotten the right answers, just by using your calculator, making sure it's in radian mode. All right. Now, we have this animal right here, sine minus 1 of negative 2. But I want you to notice that the domain is between negative 1 and positive 1, okay? And so, unfortunately, this does not exist, okay? It's not real, okay? It's outside the domain. And if I was to try to type that into my calculator, so for instance, if I were to try to type inverse sine of something like negative 2, it would say undefined, okay, because it's not in the domain. So that might be something that you'd want to do first if you're faced with this on a test or a quiz or something like that, is just try to plug the number in into your calculator and see whether or not it's going to give you a valid output or not, okay? All right, so that's our inverse function so far for the sine, okay? So again, important things are make sure you know the graph, make sure you understand the domain and the range, okay? And understand how to use the unit circle. And again, we're only going to be using this first part, okay? So we're not going to be using anything else other than this first half from 90 to negative 90 degrees. All right, so in our next video, we're going to take a look at the inverse cosine function.